My name is Rabbi Bert Visotsky, and I am the director of the Louis Finkelstein Institute for Religious and Social Studies, charged with programming and public policy. And we are delighted to do an event here at the Jewish Theological Seminary honoring our military, our veterans, and our chaplains who serve them. Let me begin by saying it had been the intention of our Chancellor, Arnold Eisen, to be with us tonight. But suddenly and unexpectedly, his mother-in-law passed away this morning, and he's now in Elmira, New York, making arrangements for the funeral. So he sends his regrets, but also his respect to Admiral Howard. We have a number of special guests in the room, and I'm all but certain I will skip over one or two of you, so I'm asking in advance, please, for you to forgive me. I want to start with Rear Admiral Herman Shalansky. There you are. And because I'm a rabbi and therefore not bound by Navy protocol, I'm not going to do people in order of their rank. I'm going to do it in order of the people I like better, because the next one is one of my students, Lieutenant Rabbi Joshua Sherwin, who is the Jewish chaplain at the United States Naval Academy. And there is a captain here by the name of Robert Newson. Robert has the distinction of being this year's Council on Foreign Relations Fellow. If you have the chance later to ask him what that means, I would be really interested in hearing what that is you do. I think mostly he comes and hears lectures and eats bonbons. Yes. And somewhere now scattered around, no, here they are. The Maritime Navy ROTC is here. Give a wave, you guys. Rabbi Abby Sharofsky, my colleague and my student, works with the Jewish Welfare Board, which is charged with taking care of our Jewish military chaplains. Abby, give a wave. And next to her, Rear Admiral Chaplain, retired? Retired. Rabbi Harold Robinson of Hebrew Union College, also the director of the Jewish Welfare Board. And my colleague from across the street at Union Theological Seminary, Commander Reverend Philip Bagro. Phil, where are you? I can't even begin to recall when the last time this many uniforms were in a room at JTS. Josh Landis is here, and Josh, are you in the back? And I want to pay particular respect to Josh's late father, Rabbi Aaron Landis. I always knew Rabbi Landis as a rabbi from Philadelphia who was just one of the great exemplars of being in the congregational rabbinate. And he was also a rear admiral in the Navy chaplaincy. So we miss him, and we're really glad you're here to help us honor him. And if I may make a distinction between those who have gone and those who are very much still here. My dear colleague, I said he's had 3 careers. He was a congregational rabbi, he was vice chancellor of this Jewish Theological Seminary, and a Navy lieutenant chaplain, Rabbi Bill LeBeau. And finally, I want to honor Radio Man 3rd Class of the North Atlantic Murmansk Run, 1942 to 1945, my father-in-law, Jerry Edelman. I can promise you this, for the price of 1 vodka, you can hear the whole story of World War II. So, we're just so delighted that you're all here. Today is a special day in Navy history, although the Marines may debate that. On November 10th in 1775, by resolution of the Continental Congress, they established the Marine Corps. Now, I've been given to understand that the Navy's actually 3 weeks older. And perhaps during the Q&A, Commander Howard, you can explain the birth rate of Navy versus Marines. But we are delighted that it's not only the day before, and some of you know in the Jewish calendar, we always start holidays when it gets dark the night before. So for us, it's already Veterans Day. But on November 11th, 1919, we decided to celebrate World War I Armistice Day. And then in 1954, we turned it into Veterans Day to honor American vets of all war. And indeed, that is what we are doing here tonight. When you came in, you had the opportunity to receive an index card and a small pencil. It's not for your golf score. During the talk, you may have the opportunity to think of some questions you want to ask the Admiral, and the ushers will collect the cards at the end of her talk. I will sort through them and give them to her rapid fire. We'll figure out a way to do this, but she has been really incredibly gracious about saying that she would spend a good piece of time answering your questions. I have to say, I have been continually impressed every time I've read your bio online, and it doesn't make a difference where I read it. You always start with the fact that you are a 1978 graduate of Gateway High School in Aurora, Colorado, something you obviously are very proud of, and I really respect you for that. Michelle Howard is a graduate of the United States Naval Academy, 1982, and the Army's Command and General Staff College in 1998 with a master's in military arts and sciences. Her initial sea tours were aboard the USS Hundley and USS Lexington. While serving on board the Lexington, she received the Secretary of the Navy Navy League Captain Winifred Collins Award in May 1987. She served as in Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm, and in January 1996 became the executive officer of the USS Tortuga and deployed to the Adriatic in support of Operation Joint Endeavor, a peacekeeping effort in the former Republic of Yugoslavia. 60 days after returning from the Mediterranean deployment, Tortuga departed west on an African training cruise where the ship's sailors, with embarked Marines and U.S. Coast Guard detachment, operated with the naval services of 7 African nations. Was that when you were doing piracy? Later. One of the questions I can tell you someone is going to ask is, who played you in the Tom Hanks movie? So, she took command of the USS Rushmore on March 22, 1999, becoming the first African-American woman to command a ship in the United States Navy. She was commander of the Amphibious Squadron 7 from May 2004 to September 2005, deploying with Expeditionary Strike Group. Operations included tsunami relief efforts in Indonesia, maritime security operations in North Arabian Gulf. She commanded the Expeditionary Strike Group 2 from 2009-2010 and deployed to CENTCOM Theater. I'm going to ask you now, please. I hope when you talk there will be no acronyms. Okay. Your guys have been sending me emails that I've had to Google virtually every other word to know what is it they're saying, which isn't to say that we rabbis aren't guilty of the same thing, but we do it in Hebrew. Admiral Howard commanded Task Force 151, the multinational counter-piracy effort, there it is, and Task Force 51, Expeditionary Forces. In 2010, she was Maritime Task Force Commander for BALTOPS, I assume that's Baltic operations, under the 6th Fleet. Shore assignments include Senior Military Assistant to the Secretary of the Navy, Chief of Staff to the Director for Strategic Plans and Policy, Joint Staff Deputy Commander, U.S. Fleet Forces Command, and Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Operations, Plans, and Strategy. She currently serves as the 38th Vice Chief of U.S. Naval Operations. Michelle Howard. I left you a space.
Thank you for that warm welcome. Well, let me start so we don't have to wait to the Q&A as to why the Marine Corps claims to be the oldest service. I will remind you that they formed their service in a tavern, and all good mythology starts in bars over drinks. One more thing I'd like to talk about before I begin my formal remarks. So last Friday, I was in Jacksonville, Florida. I had been invited by the chaplains there to speak for the anniversary of our Navy Chaplain Corps, 239th anniversary. And as we got closer to the date, I suddenly realized what induced me to stand up in front of a group of people who are professional speakers and try and give them a speech. And so then I thought, well, let me just be bold and I'll just start with the joke about the chaplains. And I would like to share that joke with you because I think you'd enjoy it. So there's 3 chaplains who are very good friends, a priest, a Protestant, and a rabbi. And they're waiting for the admiral to come in. And they just start arguing over theology like they normally do. And then they start arguing over when does life begin. And the Protestant says, you know, life begins at birth. And they're good friends. And the priest goes, no, 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 no. Life begins at conception. And the rabbi goes, you're both wrong. Life begins when the kids move out and the dog dies. So for this officer, life begins anytime you can escape the Beltway. So thank you very much for the opportunity to get outside the bounds of the E-ring and come talk to you, all of you. But one of the reasons I agreed to come speak on Veterans Day when I talked to Rabbi Burt was there is a conversation I did want to have a dialogue on and get your perspectives. So over the last few years, there have been some high-profile ethics cases within the Pentagon. And I have been developing my own thoughts on ethics and what's important. And I've had this conversation a couple of times with different groups. But as I start to formulate and think about how do I need to talk as a leadership about ethics, I thought this would be the perfect group to have you hear my thoughts. And then perhaps in the Q&A, and I'm more than happy to talk about pirates during the Q&A or the mythology of the Marine Corps. But if there's any perspectives that you would be willing to share with me concerning ethics, I would very much appreciate you as a sounding board. But on the eve of Veterans Day, I am almost compelled to highlight the amazing accomplishments of our women and men in the armed forces. When we find ourselves protecting our nation, our comrades, our ideals, we are capable of mighty strength, wonderful courage, and utter selflessness. And we can withstand horrific circumstances and will voluntarily accept dire hardship because we believe in the importance of what we are doing. And although this same thought is foundational to the United States military, this principle applies to all human beings. I would say courage is the nexus of discipline and action based on the belief of higher calling than oneself. And your rejoinder might be, Admiral, we call that faith. So whether by virtue of courage or faith or both, heroic accomplishments are underpinned by an enduring and sustained set of ethics. To push yourself beyond what you thought you could do requires an absolute belief that what you are doing is the right thing. Dr. Martin Luther King famously said that the ultimate measure of man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. We hear these words and we instinctively think they are true. Although it might be anathema to push back on a world-recognized leader, Nobel Peace Prize winner, and fantastic preacher, what if Dr. Martin Luther King is wrong? What if our true measure is tested during times of comfort and convenience? What happens when we fail in faith and courage in the times and space in between challenge and controversy? So let me explore this premise by starting with an example that illustrates the measure of men during a time of challenge when they demonstrated faith and courage. In 1943, the United States Army transport ship Dorchester was crossing the North Atlantic. She carried 902 servicemen and was bound for Greenland. The Atlantic was notoriously dangerous as German U-boats were constantly patrolling. As a precaution against sudden attack, all hands and passengers were ordered to sleep in their clothing and wear life jackets at all times. On 3 February, a German U-boat fired 3 torpedoes at the Dorchester. She began to sink, and the commanding officer immediately called to abandon ship. The scene was chaos. The hit injured or killed a large portion of the crew, knocking out the power and plunging the ship into complete darkness. Men had ignored the order to stay close, so they rushed to the frigid February weather, completely vulnerable to the cold. Men clamored to the lifeboats, but in the panic, several of the boats were overcrowded or capsized. The one steadifying and fortifying presence the night of this challenge and controversy were 4 chaplains of different faiths. Lieutenant George Fox was Methodist, Lieutenant Alexander Good, Jewish, Lieutenant John Washington was Catholic, and Lieutenant Clark Poling was Dutch Reformed. These 4 men sprang into action on the deck of the sinking Dorchester. They comforted, tended, and calmed the members of the crew. Rabbi Good even stopped a sailor as the sailor was rushing back towards his berthing. When the sailor told the rabbi that he was going to get his gloves, Rabbi Good gave the sailor his gloves, convincing the sailor to take his only pair by telling him he had another set. It quickly was clear that there were not enough life jackets for everyone. All 4 chaplains removed their life jackets and handed them to fellow crew members. Within 20 minutes, the Dorchester sank. Survivors of the event would remember all their lives the voices of the 4 chaplains who continued to offer calming prayers even as they linked arms and embraced each other as they went down with the ship. And every time I hear this tale, I am inspired by the bravery of those 4 chaplains. It is undoubtedly a resounding example of physical and emotional courage, and just one story reflective of the larger legacy built by centuries of service from our chaplain corps. The value of the Dorchester and those chaplains shows us that when framed in terms of absolute battle or protecting one's fellow soldiers or sailors, heroic action in times of challenge and controversy seems to be a black and white choice. The path to valor might lead through terrible trials or end in sacrifice, but the way is always clear. And as the years have stretched since 2001, a larger and larger percent of the armed forces and of my Navy is made up of steadfast souls who volunteered to join the military in a time of armed conflict. Since 9/11, this generation, like the greatest generation of World War II, has signed up for and participated and taken on the terrible burden of war. I am awed and humbled by their actions and am proud to serve with them. And I with them mourn their sacrifices. But this generation has proven courage and faith in their times of controversy and challenge. But as we transverse out of a 2-campaign war, where are we in times of convenience and comfort? Are there daily circumstances that more of us face in our lives where Dr. King's measure of men and women is no less true? How do we fare in relative peace or at the times when we are far from actual battleground? Do we have courage and faith in the times and space in between? So let me start with a place that I believe is as in between space and time as any other, and that would be the Pentagon. Whether or not you have served in the Pentagon, I'm sure you've heard stories about it. We have all lived through similar situation of in-between times and space, times of comfort and convenience, when it doesn't seem like our actions matter one way or another. We know of situations where it may seem harmless to shirk responsibilities, harmless to refuse to take ownership for something, harmless to dare to speak the truth. In every one of these situations, it seems inconsequential. It's a simple matter or a convenience to justify leaving things alone. In some cases, your friends might even advocate you let things go, or a coworker might ask you to look the other way. And there might be a possibility of a negative consequence that induced you to stay silent. Perhaps you fear a bad evaluation or that you might get fired. But it's at these times that we most need courage. We need the gumption to speak truth to authority, even and especially when lives are not on the line. We need moral stamina, faith to adhere to values during the in-between times and spaces. And through small acts of courage, our character is revealed. I'd like to put this in the perspective of Aristotle and his thoughts on virtue and government. He pointed out that the public becomes unrestful when the treasury of a nation is stolen by government officials. Virtue, ethical behavior is so important to the running of a democracy that he felt we should publicly honor elected officials who have proven to be incorruptible. And I note that he said honor, not reward. Honor those who are incorruptible. Honors to the virtuous reassures the people that their representatives are doing the right thing. I think today we would call this public honoring transparency. And Aristotle also made it clear for us who are the officials. We must practice ethics in the little things so that we can act ethically in the large things. The fortification of our ethics comes from conscious focus on the practice of doing the right thing when consequence seems inconsequential. Ethics is maintaining course and speed during the in-between times and space. So in the same way that we exercise so that our bodies have muscle and stamina and drive to be physically ready for times of conflict and controversy, we must develop ethical muscles that are routinely flexed in times of convenience and comfort. We must measure ourselves, our character, in time of convenience and comfort. And Henry David Thoreau would probably phrase it this way: we cannot dream ourselves into the greatness of the 4 chaplains on the Dorchester. It's only by daily acts of courage and faith that we hammer and forge ourselves into that character. And I have a modern scenario where it feels like lines might be blurred and virtue is within our grasp. In this era of instant media download and easy file sharing, the realities of intellectual property and copyright laws are hard to keep in mind. And the internet is another sort of in-between time and space place. It's another instance that seems even less clear, that the consequences are less dire and the actions less harmful. So if I watch a movie on the internet that I didn't pay for, who will it hurt? What if I download it for free and then distribute it to my friends? What if I sell it for my own profit? Where do you draw the line of right and wrong? And many people, particularly younger ones, don't see illegal downloading as a big deal. The New York Times reported that the American Assembly at Columbia University conducted a study about virtual downloading behavior. It found that 70% of young adults between 18 and 29 had copied or downloaded music or video for free, and almost 30% got most of their collections that way. The same article explained that a social computing research at Microsoft found that young internet users became angry when peers used their works without permission. However, the same users didn't see a problem in lifting images from movies for use in their own work. The virtual world represents a place where right and wrong is harder to discern. We have a sense of what is our own intellectual property, but fail to extend these restrictions to all material. And in this case, the courage would have to be twofold. We must resist the social pressures of prevailing attitude, while at the same time struggle to impose boundaries for ourselves in a world that is ever changing. Our ethical decisions must apply in all domains and worlds. And so if the act of taking music or media is stealing, then failure to speak the truth, to act with courage, has consequence on our character. And when we're challenged in times of convenience and comfort, practicing courage and faith in small doses is how we create a foundation that keeps us virtuous. So I'd like to finish with one small story on courage, a demonstration of a single small act that had significance for me. I count among my heroes an anonymous officer of the deck. Now, an officer of the deck is a person who's on watch or duty, and the officer of the deck, whether on ship or shore, maintains vigilance. They either ensure the ship's on the right course and speed, or that a command is in compliance with regulations. In my story, which is true, the officer of the deck is a real person, but I don't know his name. In fact, I don't know very much about him. I'm fairly sure that he was in the Navy during World War II, and I'm very certain that his race is white. And please bear with me, his race is important to this story. More important is that the anonymous OOD had the courage to step in during a time of comfort when wrong was being done. Years ago, I met Lieutenant Commander Wesley Brown, U.S. Navy retired. He was the first African American to graduate from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1949. We met infrequently at events or sat on history panels together, and he talked to me about his experiences at Annapolis and his years in the Navy. And all I can say is that I wish I had Wesley's brown grace. And we can forget how arduous life was in the 1940s. Our social norms were completely different. Our country was segregated, and states had varying degrees of Jim Crow laws. Transportation was segregated, and interracial marriage was against the law. And in many states, if you were black and beyond the full rights of citizenship and, quite frankly, decency, if you had one drop of African American blood, You did not have the full rights of citizenship. Midshipman Brown started Annapolis in 1945. He was the 6th black man to attempt to get through the school and the first to endure the hazing and make it to graduation. And I often think how diehard the officers and brigade of midshipmen had to be over that first century, as West Point's first African-American graduate was in 1877. Wesley had a room of his own because no one would room with him. That meant he had no one to rely on for 4 years. And he told me, and he's told others, that he thought about quitting every day. But he also shared a story of hope. He recalled getting up early one morning to get his room ready for inspection, and then he rushed back from class to present his room, and he was stunned. His room had been trashed. He felt his world reeling, and he felt he couldn't take it anymore. And then the officer of the deck, my hero, showed up. Wesley came to attention. There was silence and more silence. And the officer of the deck looked around, and he finally spoke. Midshipman Brown, I suspect this room did not like this morning. And Wesley said, no, sir. And with the carry-on, the officer of the deck departed. Wesley felt shaken with relief, and he went to bed thinking about what had happened, and by the next morning decided he could make it through at least one more day. And from the first time I heard that story, I've continued to think about this anonymous officer of the deck. Every colleague, every midshipman, except Wesley, looked like him. His world of comfort and convenience did not include people who looked like Wesley Brown. There had to be pressure, or worse still, a presumption of righteousness in conspiring to get Wesley to quit. And in one simple act, the officer of the deck broke ranks. And in doing the right thing, he may have incurred hostility or censorship from his friends in the campus wardroom. And the pressure would not have just been from the school, his workplace. It was probably in the local community. The officer of the deck demonstrated our core value of courage, and in a few words set a wrong right. And I believe that was at some cost. We don't have his side of the story, so we don't know if there was more that he did. We do know that his one act made a difference in Wesley's life, and I know that meeting and talking with Lieutenant Commander Wesley Brown made a difference in my life. We should consider the officer of the deck and his taking on a wrong, and particularly I think here on Veterans Day, remember him and the gift of example that he gives us. Should the opportunity to perform a simple act come our way, we must have the courage to do the right thing. So thank you for your listening tonight. May God bless all of our service members and their families here and around the world. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm going to do what my actual job here is. I'm a professor of rabbinic commentary, so I'm going to comment on two of your stories. The first one is the story of the 4 chaplains. We here at JTS are raised on that story, and one of the reasons we're raised on that story is just on the other side, on Riverside Drive, there is a plaque memorializing those 4 chaplains. And most of us, when we come here, have the opportunity to mosey over there and walk on the lawn and see that plaque. And of course, we all tell one another the story because it is a model for all of us on how to do the right thing. One of my professors, a Talmud professor, pointed out that according to Jewish law, the rabbi need not have given up his life jacket and could have claimed his seat in the lifeboat because we are utilitarian, and if you are in possession of what you need, you are in possession of it. He said, but to do that would have been a disgrace of God's name. And so that rabbi did the right thing above and beyond rabbinic law by going down with his colleagues. And the story, as you tell it, really moves us continually to this day. I want to start with the first question while many of you have the opportunity to fill out your cards. And that is, you told a very moving, poignant story about Wesley Brown. And obviously, you've done pretty well in the Navy. so far. And I'm tempted to say, and will you come back when you're chief? But I won't. I would like you to comment, since this is a Jewish seminary and you are African American. Would you comment on the role of minorities in the military now? And when I say minorities, it's kind of silly because I'm including women who aren't in fact a minority. But Jews, African Americans, Hispanics. Is it still very much a white man's military? Is there still hazing? The kind of things you described with Wesley Brown, are those still issues? And how did you become the fabulous admiral you are?
Bert, that was like 4 questions. So let me start with the last one. Well, thank you for categorizing me as fabulous. So I'll say that would probably be my parents and good shipmates and a good husband. Then about where the Navy is in terms of different affinity groups, particularly gender, we reflect the demographics of the United States, with the exception of gender, and that some of that is based on where we came with the law. So women could serve in the armed forces as reservists, and that really came to fruition during World War II. Coming out of World War II, there were debates on whether or not women should be active duty. Congress said, yes, we'll do that, but they capped the percentage of women to 2%, and they made a law that women could not be a general or an admiral. That law did not change till 1967. We lifted the cap on women, and all of the services started to have their first women admirals, and most of them were the heads of the nurse corps. So the Navy had their first women admiral in 1972. About the time I came in the Navy, post all-volunteer force, 1972, I came in 78. Women were about 5% of the Navy, and then we're about 18% today. So our presence has continued to grow, and then as the law has changed, particularly the combat exclusion law in 1994, that's allowed us to have women serve everywhere in the United States Navy. So we've been on ships, we've been on destroyers, we've served in every conflict, we've had a women fighter pilot of a squadron, we've had a women commander carrier strike group, and then in the last few years, our biggest breakthrough was putting women on submarines. So there is one area for all of the services that's still closed, that's Special Forces, and then for our counterparts in the Marine Corps and Army, infantry and armored, and in the last couple of years, the Secretary of Defense said, I want all of the positions to be opened, and I want the services to come back and talk to me about what they think needs to be closed and why. And so all the services are working their way through a review on what few things are, for the Navy and Air Force, what few things are closed, and then a much a bigger discussion with the Army and Marine Corps. So so let me give you somebody else's perspective about how the demographics have changed, and I'll use my older brother, who came into the Navy in the 70s and served for 9 years, and then would talk to me about how isolated he felt as a minority in the Navy. 20 years later, he came out to my change of command when I took over Rushmore, and we had all the sailors standing in ranks, and after the ceremony, he came up to me and he goes, this crew looks like, well, our hometown. Is this legal? So I think for people who haven't come to see the Navy, it's just as you've talked about, all of these folks who are members, graduates of JTS are in the Navy. We really have significantly changed. And absolutely, the opportunity is there for anybody to grow up to be anything they want to be.
I'm going to press you a little. I'm going to press you because we read reports in the news, and one of the questions asks, what about sexual violence against women in the armed forces? What's being done to teach men and their commanding officers the ethics to respond to their colleagues? And that maybe it's a very isolated issue and the press blows it up. I don't know. But I suspect as the woman among them all, that this is of special interest to you?
It's of special interest to anybody who's a leader. So if I may, I'd like to put it in context. So some of this sort of got into the public attention in 2012 with the Department of Defense report. And I'm one of those people that when I hear about something, I ask my folks to come get me the report. It's like 850 pages. And I worked my way through it. What was not well advertised in the media is at the end of that report in 2012, the Department of Defense had hired the Center for Disease Control to do a study on sexual violence in the military. And so they did. It's an annex in the report, and it's mentioned in the executive summary. They went out and they interviewed active duty women, and then they interviewed mostly women spouses to get a sense of domestic violence. And then they put it in context because CDC does ongoing, continuing studies of sexual violence of women in America. Their conclusion was the sexual violence that we saw was either on par or actually a little bit better than what we have outside the wire. So that's hard for me to hear as a woman. So what we're saying is my hometown has the same problems that I have in the Navy. But as a naval leader, what is hard for me to hear is that my sailors are not better than as they should be, and they're not better than the communities they came from. We should be setting the example. So that report sort of gave me an understanding of where the Navy fits in all of this. But sexual assault is a crime. The other thing I have found is, as I've talked about this, is that we have a much broader definition of sexual assault than outside communities. That if we go from unwanted touching all the way up to the most heinous crime, which is rape, and that depending on statute and state laws, there's a variation of scale, but the assault is more narrowly defined. So when we talk about data that looks at thousands of numbers, it's across a broad range of activity. All of it's still wrong, but it's not, in people's minds, they automatically leap to rape. Then the other thing is that people presume this is women as victims. That is not true. That when you talk about sexual assault, whether it's in the service or outside in our communities, this is both men and women as victims. And this is not just sailors. This is we account for everything. That this could be someone sexually assaulted in the community who reports to it to a command, sexually assaulted by a member from another service, or sexually assaulted overseas. We just count the numbers when they report, because the most important thing for us is we want our women and our men to report so that we can take care of them. We can get them medical treatment, we can take care of them psychologically, but also we can encourage them to go through an examination and to be able to set the groundwork should they choose to prosecute it. And then every case, from the least egregious to the most egregious, we investigate every case, which is not true in the outside world. So for the training for our sailors and for our officers, we have been working on the culture of people understanding what is sexual assault. And I was really surprised when I was down at Fleet in 2012 and we started to hold this training, and we would get some of the junior sailors who would come up and say, "Oh my gosh, I think I was sexually assaulted and I never understood that that's what had happened to me." That how they think about life and behavior is not the way more mature adults think about life and behavior. So our goal is to get the sailors to understand right and wrong, and that when they see wrong, like that one OD, that they step in and do the right thing and help out their shipmate.
You had mentioned earlier, I think I understood you correctly, that you came into the Navy just at the transition to an all-volunteer force. but since you've already admitted that you will read 800-page tomes, I'd like to hear your...
And the Bible.
Yes, well, that's a good book to read. I'd like to hear your take on what do you think has shifted in military service since we've become an all-volunteer force? Is it different? Has it changed quite literally the complexion of the military? What are the implications of the current status?
I talked a little bit earlier tonight. So one of the significant things that's happening in front of our eyes is we just went through a 2-campaign war with an all-volunteer force. And when I said I am in deep admiration of this generation, I'm quite sincere. That means that from 9/11 on, this group over here, their colleagues, their predecessors, volunteered to go into ROTC, volunteered to go to Annapolis or West Point or the Air Force Academy. Sailors and soldiers and airmen and Coast Guardmen volunteered to come into the service fully witting to what they were going to be employed and where they were going to go. And some of the most amazing vignettes of them played in front of my eyes, where I went to a graduation at Annapolis a few years ago, and there's a Marine lieutenant who's a W amputee, and he only graduated a couple of years ahead of the midshipmen. And they're there to, stay close to him, be good comrades, but they're also there ready to go on and do what they think is necessary for the freedom of this country. So the patriotism of this generation is undeniable, and that they believe in the defense of this nation and in the defense of the Constitution in a way that other generations have not been tested. And now that it's been since 9/11 and we're a volunteer force, the majority of the Navy and the Armed Forces are people who've come in since then, probably going on 60-65%. So most of our force are these people who have come in eyes wide open, willing to sacrifice all for this country. And that is really inspiring.
So you talked about people's patriotism, and that's undeniable. And your main talk talked about the ethics and the faith and courage that is required. Are you willing to comment a little more on the potential conflict between duty and honor and between discipline and loyalty?
So this gets to the challenges of times in between. And I was sincere when I said I've been having this dialogue with different folks. Where and how do we set the boundaries of the ethical framework, and when is gray? And I was very fortunate. I got to host a retired 1-, 2-, and 3-star conference, and I had 220 admirals show up, and thank you, Harold, for being 223rd. But in the course of having this ethical dialogue with the admirals, one of them, very wise man, stood up and said, our sense of right and wrong actually got tested during our first tours in the Pentagon. That we would be in charge of a program, and then somebody would say, well, it might be underperforming slightly, but it's best if you phrase it this way. You might not be making this milestone, but it's best as you phrase it this way. And then he said, as you work your way through the presentation with your boss over your shoulder, you get farther and farther away from the truth and accuracy. And you're told that's what you're supposed to do. And so you can get close to your work and start to lose your objectivity, which means you're straying farther away from doing the right thing and maybe being a good steward of the taxpayers' money. But all of that seems to start in areas where things aren't so clean, black and white. And that, I think, is the challenge. For us to hang on to this sense of what is right. And remember, it's not the amount, it's the habit that determines what's right and wrong. That we have to categorize and recall what we do in terms of our activities.
think we have time for 2 more questions. And these are audience questions. I'm reading them right from the cards. I'm not making them up just to give you a hard time, because these might be the ones that'll be most difficult to answer. This one says, recent presidents and the majority of elected officials have not been part of the armed services. Do you think they are able to understand the challenges you face, and are they responsible to your needs? Answer carefully.
Or do you want me to answer truthfully? What do you? That's a small test of courage and loyalty and duty. Yes. So whether an official is an elected official or an appointed official, there's not a vacuum. There is a dialogue that happens between senior military leaders and elected officials. Particularly in our case, there's the military committees that we go testify to, or we have one-on-one dialogue with. And no matter what time frame, not everybody in the House and Senate has been in the military. They have other, whatever region or state elects them, they are elected for what they can do for their people and then that leadership position. But I have found that regardless of someone's occupation, there is some thread of commonality with that person when I'm talking to them. And I've also found it is my responsibility to speak English to people. You talked about the jargon that happens. Well, what I find is we're so comfortable in our own sphere, we tend to stop speaking English to people. And if we take the time to really think about our communications, people are very understanding of what we do. And then the last thing, and maybe this is appropriate for Veterans Day, no matter what state or territory an elected official is from, there are veterans who are their constituents who live in that state. And all of them, trust me, all of them know that.
So when I saw you, I don't even remember when it was, a number of months ago,
It's May.
in May, you were still a vice admiral. Mm-hmm. And you've gotten your 4th star. You're the vice chief of naval operations. That's VCNO, right? Even Rabbi Shirofsky referred to you as the VCNO. It's like, that's your name. The question has been asked, and I'm reading it right off the card. What has been the biggest challenge you have faced as Vice Chief of Naval Operations? And what do you see as the biggest challenge the Navy is facing?
Well, the good news is I have a plethora of challenges. I'm not going to ever get bored in this job. Right now, it's getting to understanding with the Congress and the White House and the budget. And so you have this group who are concerned about the deficit, and they feel that one way to work about the deficit is to decrease the revenue that goes to the Department of Defense. So we end up in this sort of dialogue. I have reminded some folks that Congress maintains a Navy, and then with the budget, they're just telling us how much Navy they want to maintain. Our responsibility is if based on how much money we're going to get over the next 5 years, that we can only maintain a much smaller Navy. So we have 289 ships today. If sequestration happens, we figure we would only be able to sustain maybe 250 ships. And now we're back to a Navy that was where we were going into World War I and was not a global power. It's having this dialogue and getting folks to understand what happens if we sequester, and getting the leaders, the congressional leaders, an opportunity to really understand that if they make this decision, what's the impact it's going to have on the Navy, on the Army, the Marine Corps, and the Air Force. So that That's challenge number one, getting people to understand. Challenge number two, cyber. We do not understand that we are living and working in the cyber domain every day. And it is a dense environment. There's criminals out there, there's women and children out there. Everything we do is connected, from using your ATM to getting online to do your online banking. And then as I talk to our folks and then talk to sailors, they have a trust about the internet and the cyber domain that people over 30 don't have. And if I could just give you one live audience demonstration. So when I was down in Fleet, I had a group of sailors do a survey of all the sailors, and we had surface, submarines, aircraft carriers, Seabees. So let me just give you a demonstration. If I asked you how many of you had one television set, how many of you would raise your hand? Most of you? Keep your hands up. Do you have 2 TVs? 3 TVs? 4 TVs? 5 TVs? A few of you have 5 TVs. If I asked you if you had one smartphone, how many of you would raise your hand? Most of you. Do you have 2 smartphones? 3 smartphones? No? If I asked you how many laptop computers do you have, do each of you have at least one laptop and computer? 2? 3? 4? 5? No one. If I asked you gaming consoles, how many of you have at least 2 gaming consoles? 3? 4? Here's what 1,000-person survey across the fleet. Average person under age 30 who's a sailor has 5 television sets, a combination of 10 laptops and tablets, 5 smartphones, and 10 gaming consoles. We are in a different world. Or they're looking at me going, "No, Admiral, you're in a different world." They are living in this cyber domain in a way that we do not understand. They spend 4 to 5 times more online, and it's not by gender. It's social medias. Their number 1 activity is social media, and their number 2 is gaming. And for the folks over 30, our number 1 activity is some sort of sport or outdoor hobby. And then we're online, but we're not in Facebook, we're not in Twitter, we're not in any of that. And so we have this cyber divide between our leaders and our sailors. And it's dangerous out there. It is physically dangerous in the domain, and I don't have a virtual version of the shore patrol or, these establishments are off limits. So we have got to come to grips with the personal life of our sailors and their professional life, because they are melded in this domain, and help them become vigilant sailors in this domain. So that, to me, is my biggest challenge as VCNO.
Admiral Michelle, thank you so much for being here. I want to end tonight with a prayer, and this is a prayer written by my colleague, Rabbi Arnold Resnikoff, who is a retired captain of the Navy Chaplains Corps. Arnie served on a gunboat in Vietnam, then came to rabbinical school, and then went back for a full career of service in the Navy. And he wanted us to offer this prayer that he wrote. Adonai, God who gives everything a season, and a time for every purpose under heaven, a time for war, a time for peace, a time for life, a time for death, and always time for hope. We take time now to honor those who serve, who fight, who sacrifice in times of war, so that the time of peace, of real peace, might one day be. We offer thanks for freedoms that are far from free, for they are bought and paid for at the cost of lives cut short and family dreams that now can never be. The cost of wounded souls and broken bodies, and lives forever changed by suffering, and memories so painful that most of us give thanks that we will never know, nor ever fully comprehend such pain. Adonai, God who gives everything a season and a time for every purpose under heaven, we honor those who served and mourn those who gave their lives. And we honor those who live and serve today within a world that knows too well the time of war. We honor in a special way all military families, those who they love and who love them, for whom even far-off battlefields are much too close to home. Give us faith, the strength, the wisdom, too, we pray, to do our part, to bring about the time of peace for which they fought and fight, the time of peace for which we pray, the time of peace, just peace, in which we must keep faith, the world of peace which we must do our part to build. And let us say, Amen. Thank you.
Thank you.